All right, so those who are here in the room, everyone who's around, I'm going to start off with a quick question. Raise your hand if you're nowhere. You're nowhere? Nowhere. No one, right? Oh, well, I know it's a platform now. But it's one of those absolutes, right? We're always somewhere. Our brain resides in our body, and our body resides in environments. We're always somewhere. And that matters. Each of you in this large ecosystem that Steelcase has created chose different places to be. You chose different chairs. You chose different environments. Some of you chose to stand. Some of you chose to be in groups. Some of you chose to be loners. It matters. But just like the brain is invisible to us, Marta was making the point earlier today that somehow the environment seems to be invisible to us. We live and breathe in it all the time. But we don't really notice it. We take it for granted. But our environments are not neutral. They actively harm or they actively help. Our relationship with our environments is what is called place. By itself, this is a container. When I inhabit it, I make it place. I can give you statistics about, the environment harms. Like, we are responsible for 14.4 gigatons of carbon emissions a year. That's harm. Zip code is a predictor of mortality because of access to healthy foods, healthcare, education, and you could be just 5 miles apart, but still have different mortality rates, and that's because of land use and zoning, and that's harm. The example that Kazi just gave about air quality having a clinical effect, that's harm. During COVID, we couldn't stop, like, no matter how much we convinced people that this is about air quality and ventilation, people kept buying hand sanitizers. And what I took away from that was it's difficult for us to understand the harm that something not immediately visible to us causes. But our built environment creates the stage for the lives we live. So as we go into this discussion, I'm a researcher. I am all for the data. I'm all for the evidence. But I will tell you that there is enough evidence on how the built environment helps or harms, depending on how we intersect it with people and programs and policies and processes. So let's take evidence as a given, enough to get started. And let's talk about the actions we can take and what role the built environment can play to really get us to impact. On the right there in that little board, you'll see our pilot project behind you on getting to a brain-healthy workplace. Oh, thank you, Julie. And that's about what can the workplace do for brain health, but only if you're also training the brain and training your workplace with it. We can use the same challenge for learning environments, for healing environments. There's so much we could unpack. But again, what is the point of the evidence if you're not taking action with it? So I am beyond delighted today that what we have for you is a panel of disruptors, a panel of people who are actually changing how we build for brain capital, whether or not they call it that. We talked about brain capital building. This is about building for brain capital. We have with us first Jen Kolstad, if you will come on stage. She's the Global Design and Brand Director for Ford, responsible for introducing the Brain to Building framework for corporate strategy. That's pretty incredible. Welcome, Jen. All right, claps are really good for our health. We also have Clayton Mitchell, who is a veteran with Kaiser and Jefferson, who has built so many healthcare facilities. But he won't talk about buildings today. He'll talk about compassionate capitalism and capital projects. Welcome, Mitch. I learned something new from Tom Osha every time he opens his mouth. So I'm a little excited about what he's going to say today. Tom Osha is an investor and an innovator who is invested in innovation ecosystems, and will talk about the intersection of the built environment and people to really craft change. So welcome, Tom. And this gives us time, because he's coming from the back. This can be a long clap. We have Dr. Bill Reichman, who is walking the talk. He is a physician, an innovator, and has a brand new vision for senior living that he will talk to us about, which changes the paradigm. Welcome, Bill. And finally, Marta Schwartz, who is the co-executive director at the ULI Sustainability Center and has been having many conversations with me about the intersection of climate, human, and economic health. So we have an incredible panel. What we'll do is have the panel give a few opening remarks. Then we'll have a few questions to pose to them, and then you will all have questions that they will react to in closing remarks. I only state that because it means you have to stay engaged throughout. Right? Thank you so much. So with that, Jen, I'm going to hand the mic to you, and we will go down the line.
Okay, 2 minutes, right?
2 minutes, right.
We'll go fast. I think I'm the oddball in the room. My background is art, interior architecture, human experience design, and now I hang out with car designers. So what I'm doing here, I'm not sure, but I thought I'd introduce myself using a case study to really ground the discussion today in tangibility. At this moment, Ford Motor Company is building a 2 million square foot, I can't say world headquarters, but we'll say new campus. 12,000 people will ultimately occupy that building. This is replacing a campus that exists today. If any of you have visited Ford before or seen the movie Ford versus Ferrari, that's okay too. There's a green glass tower, and really the campus is extremely decentralized, meaning there are buildings all over the place, and people have to come together to be able to do what? To collaborate and work together. So this new building design, which is a huge investment for Ford Motor Company. In fact, we have gambled on it as our future, the next generation, our next chapter, because the building is invested not for what it looks like, and it will be beautiful. Of course it will be beautiful. It's designed by Snøhetta here in New York City. But for what it does, the building must accomplish the following. It must elicit innovation and creativity. It must bring people together in a new way of working together, a new form of community. It must stimulate behavioral change. Do you hear what I'm saying? It has to do a lot for us that is not about what it looks like. And to that note, I hear a lot about this notion of beauty, and it sort of dismisses what it is that we do. It's like beauty is gratuitous somehow. We have the data to tell us that beauty is predicated upon a lot of very specific things that serve our brains well. But what it does, the performative outcomes of architecture, is really what we're going to talk about today, because this is the next generation of design.
Well said. Thank you.
All right. Clayton Mitchell, it almost seems like an oxymoron for a retired naval officer and engineer to talk about compassionate capitalism, right? But if you think about, and it's been said a couple of times, 20% of the health outcomes for folks happen inside a medical facility. 80% is everything that's happening outside the medical facility. So if you're really thinking about improving the health of the community by just focusing on the health part of the equation, you might be a little bit shortchanged there, because there's folks that are going out and they're worried about the next meal. They're worried about a roof over their head. They're worried about basic safety. They're at that low end of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, just trying to get by. Healthcare doesn't come until you go up towards self-actualization. So really, to improve the health of a community, you have to get the majority of that population up that chain towards self-actualization, to the place where they're not worried about the basic elements of just living and surviving, that they do have time to think about healthy activities and behaviors, which do really sort of drive the healthy outcomes for folks. It is that key thing that sort of determines the health outcomes in one zip code versus another. And so the compassionate capitalism mode comes from the standpoint of, as you're spending money, in my case for real estate and facilities related functions, how might we do that in a way that not only delivers the built infrastructure that the system needs, but the community aspects of what the community needs too. And we often talk about, these social determinants of health, like environment and safety and things of that sort, from the standpoint of it's costly. It just costs too much money. Over my 12, 13 years specifically in healthcare, every project over $200 million has delivered under budget, right? And it's delivered on time. And we've been able to achieve that by helping leadership sort of understand the importance of strong governance, the importance of setting some standards, setting expectations up front, and then managing to those expectations through the project execution. What happens is you reduce churn, and that reduced churn reduces the cost of delivery for the AE, the GC, and the broader community. And you can take those savings, reinvest them, you can take them and maybe pour them into the facilities infrastructure. I'd like to do that, but that doesn't happen often. And you can take them and help to sort of stimulate that environmental impact outside of the facility to improve the health of the community as a whole. So the whole concept of compassionate capitalism, and I was really pleased to see Secretary Galey's comments about the closure of state hospitals in California, because I remember that time. And at that point in time, it was assumed that the community would take on that burden. Hey, we don't need to house these folks here. Their families will take care of them. Philanthropy will take care of them, and that just never materialized. And so sometimes we have to question the fundamental, reason that we have government. It is to provide those capabilities and those functions that no one entity is going to deliver on their own. And if we use the market as the determinant of ROI on everything that we do, we get what we've got today, right? So there's a saying: if you only do what you've always done, you'll only get what you've always got. And so this intense focus on shareholder value, and I'm not an anti-capitalist. I wouldn't want to live any place but in the United States. But there's got to be a balance. We've talked about that a lot today. That's balance between the policies that we have and the fabric of who we are in terms of capitalism and our democratic republic. So,
all right, very interesting, because one of the things that we've been talking a lot about just in these opening few minutes are people, right? We spent a lot of time this morning talking about processes and policies and programs, all meant to help people, but at the end of the day, right, as Upali said, people come together and they create place, right? So one of the things that I spend my time doing about 250 days a year, I'm on the road seeing close to 100 innovation districts around the world. That's all I do. Innovation districts are environments that bring together anchor-led research from universities and academic medical centers. They bring together corporate engagement, startup activity, clinical enterprise, academic pursuit, and community inclusion. Now, what I've learned from all of this is that talent is the currency of innovation. Nothing substitutes for it, and everything follows it. So at the end of the day, creating environments where that talent, where those brains that we've been talking about can be at their very best, is critically important to solving the enormous challenges that we've been talking about, whether it's the Sustainable Development Goals, whether it's the next pandemic, whether it is equity and access, all of that comes together. Second, I heard a lot this morning about integration, multi and interdisciplinary approaches to massive problems, right? These aren't going to be solved by any one approach. They're going to bring together scientists, clinicians, community members, citizen scientists, tinkerers, and those with different neurological abilities. And that brings us to inclusion. The only way to get to true inclusion, for one outcome is certainly social equity and economic mobility, but inclusion is the ability to include a variety of viewpoints, lived experiences, and make everyone feel welcome in an environment. And that's because these environments concentrate, leverage, and amplify investment. Right? They amplify that kind of money. They create this power of place into which investments can be made and leverage to a broader economic opportunity. Now, as a private developer, one of my hats as a private developer, I bring that money. I don't rely on public money, so private money comes and helps support what government is already doing, what philanthropy is already doing, building things that need to be created. Did an amazing building in Pittsburgh. It was an old Henry Ford factory. It had been designed by John Graham. 1919 is where the Model T was made. It cost $535,000 to build. It cost me $330 million to redo it as a center for immunology, for transplant cancer for the University of Pittsburgh. But it isn't just in the cities where these also happen. There are rural areas, right? There are suburban areas, and therefore we need to think about innovation as a constellation. Did a bit of this when I was in the UK with the minister of what they call leveling up, right? How do we make sure that it isn't just about London, but it's about all of our cities and rural areas across the UK? And so how do you make sure that the connections are being made so that the opportunity, the people, places, and programs can spread like a matrix, like a web, across a defined regional or even national or international geography?
Okay, I guess it's my turn. All right. Well, as Upali said in the intros, I'm a physician who has specialized in the intersection of brain and behavior. And throughout most of my career, I've been focused on aging brain and most certainly the prevention, early detection, treatment, and care of people with dementia, with Alzheimer's disease being the preeminent cause of dementia. As I've gotten older, though, my perspective has broadened. And while I spent a good part of my career focused on Alzheimer's drug development, I started to appreciate that as far as we were and as far as we needed to go in drug development, there were so many other vitally important contributors to the well-being of people suffering or at risk from these kinds of diseases. And so these days, I'm less interested in the drug development, as important as that is, and I'm really interested in the integration of the contribution of the environment of care, the setting in which an older adult is being supported, the technologies that can be marshaled to enhance that environment of care, and then critically, the philosophy and model of care which is being delivered by care providers. Historically, architects and designers thinking about the environment of care for people suffering from cognitive disorders worked in isolation from technology developers and those that were conceiving of new philosophies and models of care. Those who are working at the front end of new models of philosophy of care are largely divorced from architects and designers, and most certainly technology developers. And too many technology developers are providing us with solutions in search of a problem, right? Instead of addressing the challenges that we face in optimizing the well-being of older people suffering from dementia and perhaps preclinical states putting them at risk for dementia. So I think we're on the threshold of a new age. We have not made nearly as much progress as we should have since the mid-1970s, when we even started to think about the environment of care and the philosophy of care. That was called the culture change movement in nursing homes. But we haven't come far enough since the mid-1970s. But I do think we're on the threshold of the new age. I think now we have the sensibilities and we have the capacity to integrate the thinking behind the environment, the thinking behind the philosophy and the model of care delivery, and emerging technologies that actually are providing solutions to real-world problems. And I think we're striking finally a much better balance in our field between being very focused on the pathogenesis of these kinds of disorders and more on salutogenesis. So how do we enable well-being as opposed to focusing so heavily on addressing disability and disease?
All right. Well, my name is Marta Shantz. I work for the Urban Land Institute, and I'm coming at this topic from a real estate perspective. We are a global real estate industry group. We have 45,000 individual members across the globe, and we have the mission to shape the future of the built environment for transformative communities worldwide. We're very focused on land use and real estate. We don't lobby, which is pretty unique for an industry group. Instead, we put more emphasis on thought leadership, and I lead our Sustainability Research Center. As a part of that, we look at big tent sustainability, decarbonization, resilience, climate adaptation, health, and equity. We pull it all together. And as a part of that, we are very focused on greening buildings for healthier people. I will say that again, greening buildings for healthier people. It has direct ties to cognitive function, and I believe that's why I'm here on the panel today, to bring it together in that sense. You think about your day, you think about any human's day, humans spend 90% of their time indoors. And as Upali said, buildings are kind of invisible. You don't think about it until someone brings it up with you. So there's a real opportunity to focus on this intentionally, proactively, and make buildings help people be healthier. There's been a huge push in the real estate space, even before COVID, for healthy buildings, healthy certified buildings, green certified buildings that have healthy elements in them. And it's been a real driver for value. Investors are paying more for green and healthy certified buildings. Occupants are seeking healthy buildings, both in the multifamily residential space, but also the commercial office space. And we're also seeing it from governments. They're seeking codes and zoning and all sorts of incentives and some sticks as well, let's be real, policy motivators to push the industry further and faster. And this is because we are seeing specific connections and co-benefits between climate and health. I'm going to just give one research example that we continue to point to, and maybe you've heard of Dr. Joseph Allen with the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. He has been doing some tremendous research with his team on the cognitive benefits of healthy buildings. And for example, workers, I have my notes so I don't get the percentages wrong. For example, workers in green certified buildings, so that could be LEED, Energy Star, maybe some of these terms you've seen on a plaque in a lobby. They have 30% fewer sick building syndromes in people who are in a green certified building versus a conventional brown building. There were some studies that Dr. Joseph Allen and his team did. One was specifically around cognitive function assessments. And workers in these green buildings, they had, I think, 300 buildings, so it was a pretty substantial study. Those in optimized green environments had 131% better crisis response, 299% better work on information usage, and 288% higher performance in strategy. Just incredibly improved cognitive performance because they're in a healthier, greener building. So there's a tremendous opportunity here. Just one more, they did another green certification buildings tied to cognitive assessments. And people in those green buildings had 26% better cognitive function assessments, and occupants enjoyed 25% increase in sleep scores. And that's just because of better lighting and optimal thermal conditions. So we think about these buildings that are invisible to us, and the real opportunity we have to tie that to cognitive function and the impact we can have on people and communities.
Thank you, Marta. They were invisible to you, they're not invisible anymore. So I would ask the audience to do two things for a second. First, for what you presented in the morning or what you're thinking about, take just a second to think about where it happens and what environments need to do to get to the goals you've set for yourself. Just kind of bake that thought a little bit. And second, think about what questions you might have for the panel as we close it out. And I do want to give you a second because we never have the second to think. So here's a second. Okay. It's amazing. One of the things we learned in working with the Center for Brain Health is how little time we take to think. And as we were talking about the incredible outcomes that Marta was talking about, some recent findings are showing us one of the best ways of combating cognitive fatigue is actually fascination. It's things like wonder. It's stuff that Theo talks about a lot. The part that we can't really put our head around, really seek novelty. So here we are trying to make sure we are preventive. We're trying to make the healthy choice the easy choice. We're trying to make sure that things that we shouldn't have worried about, access to good air, good water, and nature, which are fundamental human rights, have now become premium. And we're trying to make sure that happens. At the same time, there are things that make us intrinsically human that also have measurable cognitive benefits. In fact, enriched environments, environments that meet our physical, social, sensory, and cognitive needs, can actually generate new synapses in the brain. It's called neurogenesis, and changing environmental conditions by making enriched environment, you can do that. Imagine this, if design and environmental design met the pharma industry and policy and took on the trillion-dollar dementia challenge or early childhood challenge. So I want to put this out there as a challenge and then pivot back to our panel. And we're going to take this as 3 segments of questions. I'm going to give it first to Tom and Jennifer to talk about innovation constellations. Then I'm going to give it to Bill and Clayton to talk about environments of care. And Marta, as always, you will wrap it up with the city perspective. All right, so innovation constellations. You open that door, Tom.
All right, well, then I will walk through it with an example. And I'll give you an example of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So University City is the area in Philadelphia between 30th Street Station and about 50th Street or so. It's where Penn is, Drexel, the Wistar Institute, Penn Health. There is an awful lot of research, about $1.5 billion, that sits right there. There is also an innovation district called U City Square. It features complex and beautiful research buildings where groundbreaking stuff is being done in gene and cell therapy. It also is designed, though, so that the entire ground floor is an open space for the community to come in, grab a cup of coffee, use some free Wi-Fi, have a meeting. There's spaces to have a meeting this large, or there's intimate spaces where 2 people can sit on a couch and chat. Drexel brought their School of Computing and Informatics because data is becoming more and more important to healthcare. They brought it into that building so that academics can marry with the private companies that are in that building. Cabaletta, Amicus Pharmaceuticals, Eli Lilly, Roche, Biomercuriu, and others. You walk between that building and the other buildings, and there are plazas. Right, there are plazas and places to sit. There is interesting public art to look at. It is porous because it connects to the Penn campus. In fact, I think Wharton is at the end of what's called kind of the innovation walkway between our 3711 building and the Wharton School. We put the street grid back in. This was a piece of land that was taken during urban redevelopment, and the street grid was whacked, creating a super block and blocking the communities of Mantua and Powelton Village from the economic opportunity represented on Market Street. So we put in 37th Street, extended Cuthbert and Filbert, so it's a walkable grid again. We put in a plaza. If you know anything about Philadelphia, William Penn designed it with 5 plazas. There was never one west of the Schuylkill River, and we felt there should be. A center, a front yard for the community. So we put that in. There is housing that is there. There are programs, the West Philadelphia Skills Initiative, Firsthand, that integrate science into the curriculum of the local school. We worked with Drexel University and the Philadelphia school system to put back the K through 8 school, the Powell School, and the Philadelphia Science and Leadership Academy. All this is on less than 14 acres, and I can walk from one side to the other in about 5 minutes. So it is a very dense environment, but it is a constellation of activity. It is connected, though, to what John Fry and Drexel are doing at Schuylkill Yards. It's connected to what's happening at Pennovation at Penn. It's connected to Penn Medicine, and it actually programmatically is connected to the University of Delaware, to the University of Pitt, to Rutgers, and to others. So that if you look at Philly, the outer rings are where the manufacturing is, the inner ring is where the research is, and programmatically it is all tied together. Now, Philadelphia in 8 years has gone from eds and meds, which can mean just about anything you want, to top 5 in the North American cell and gene therapy. The building whose ribbon I cut on Thursday is a 450,000 square foot sustainable building that now will house Drew Weissman, whose name you might recognize as being one of the founders of the mRNA platform upon which the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were done, and a similar ecosystem is growing around that research. And again, then the manufacturing and the other elements will be economically spread throughout the area. So it's taking an environment that really was a detriment and a scar on West Philadelphia and turning it into an area of economic opportunity, mobility, and inclusion. And if you want to, a little bit later on, I'm happy to take you through all of the scores for how we were able to make sure that procurement, jobs, apprenticeships were all coming from the various communities impacted by this.
Incredible. Thank you, Tom. Jen?
You have so much energy for this late afternoon. Oh my God.
That cup of coffee.
No kidding. I'm going to redirect your prompt just a little bit so that it suits me better, frankly. Listen, back to my case study. Clearly, the outcome, the net for this this new campus that I'm talking about is what you're asking about, right? Mm-hmm. It's a constellation of activity. But I think I'd like to share with the group how we're getting there, because this important work is something that we tackled with HKS with my good friend here, Upali. If I take us back to onset of COVID pandemic, one of our speakers earlier this morning, actually Mr. Secretary from the state of California, reminded us that this really was a catalyst of opportunity, as it was for us as well, as designers. It allowed us to bypass a whole lot of bureaucracy and kind of, skip to the needs to serve the question much more effectively. So for us, building is going up. There is 2 times the Empire State Tower worth of steel in what I'm describing to. So we'll say a lot of steel is going into the ground. Pandemic hits, we've planned it for a certain kind of workplace outcome. And the whole of the executive goes, oh my God, what are we going to do? Are you certain this is how people are going to behave on the back end of pandemic? Like, you all know this story. But the truthful answer is, no, I'm not certain of that. In fact, none of us knows, do we? Workplace behaviors have already pivoted to the extent that, if we didn't sort of revisit or realign our priorities, whatever you were building at the time it's not going to work for you. And so Upali and I and a lot of others put together a task force to really investigate the future of workplace and develop a framework that would help lead us through. And so what we have landed on is something that what we call the brain to building methodology, a framework. This is a novel exercise that is assisting designers to lead into design questions, big wicked problem types of questions, with a new team structure, a strategy to your bit about healthcare not speaking to designers, designers not speaking to healthcare, how can the outcome possibly be productive? Well, for us, we've built just a wild, beautiful team strategy that includes all the others. It's about making space for human scientists, for ecologists, for higher ed specialists. I mean, anybody who could possibly have something to contribute to a big wicked problem is invited to the table to lean in. What we decided was that it's really a vetting mechanism. If we could not answer the question, a design question, through the lens of, in our case, neurology, behavioral psychology, anthropology, if the question couldn't vet on those 3 topics and others, it couldn't carry forward. You'd have to stop and revisit the design solution. And so what we've had to do is train all of our designers and all of the consultants invited in to play with us, now in any category, not just workplace, retail, future of retail, automotive retail for electrification, manufacturing, envisioning a healthier manufacturing environment for, you can imagine the population, hundreds of thousands of people. If you can't do that through the lens of brain to building, we won't move forward together. So this team strategy is one point of innovation, but this methodology is another, and we are hoping, really hoping, that this changes the way that design is practiced moving forward.
All right, we're going to stop and clap for this segment. Tom, you laid out a real-life example of outcomes, and you laid out a real-life example of process, but a key component of both was transdisciplinarity. It was really going across disciplines and giving away some of the disciplinary arrogance in some cases that we fall victim to. So I really appreciate that. I'll take it now to Bill and Clayton talking about environments of care where the stakes are very high. Right? And so it changes, the outcomes you're looking for changes. So Bill, maybe you go first, and then Clayton follows with what it takes and what does the environment mean for environments of care.
Okay, thank you, Upali. So my area of interest, as I said earlier, are really sort of aging-related cognitive disorders, with dementia being really the end state of that. And I wholly agree with the premise that it does take a village to figure out the best way to integrate environmental considerations, care approaches, and leveraging the opportunities that technology offers. What we haven't said so much of, but which is critical to the way in which we approach this in our ecosystem, is having that older adult and their family member, as well as the care providers, at the center of the conversation, and have them inform a lot of the design thinking. So they are very much a part of that transdisciplinary team. The end users, the people who are actually going to experience whatever innovations we're able to collaboratively assemble. By and large, what we've developed in Toronto and now through a global network is a different kind of ecosystem, but an ecosystem nonetheless of designers, architects, engineers, clinicians, certainly, as I said, family members, social anthropologists, tech people who come together around a challenge set or a series of challenge sets. So we have a need. Can you help find the right integrative solutions? And we're largely focused on that setting of care. Now, if I were to ask you, as you get older and you start to experience, which is inevitable for many of us, cognitive and or physical frailty, which setting of care would you prefer? Staying at home in the community or going into a nursing home? How many of you would rather stay at home in the community? How many of you would prefer to go into a congregate care environment like a nursing home? Okay, almost nobody. Well, in part your answer is reflective of an idealistic view of what it's actually like today to try to be cared for 24/7 in your own home in the community if you have cognitive or physical frailty. It's more of wishful thinking than reality. And the second reason you responded the way you did was largely an indictment of our present concept of the nursing home. Nobody wants any part of that, right? Shame on us. But I do think we're on the threshold of a new age. And by bringing together thinkers from these different disciplines, supporting their creative ideation, and then testing their ideas in real-world environments, which is what we do, both on our campus across the full continuum of where seniors live, as well as through a network of beta test sites, 150 of them, across different care settings in North America, we're able to test these ideas, evaluate the consequences, and then provide solutions so that someday, when we say we'd rather stay at home, we have good reason to want to stay at home, because the environment at home and the care provision and the supporting technologies are meeting our needs, and we won't be so afraid to go into a congregate care environment. Because again, through the leveraging of new care approaches, technologies, right, and the proper environment, these can be very enriching places for people to live, where there's more of a sense of community than we could ever have living alone in our own homes. So that's what I see as the opportunity going forward. Thank you.
So talking about environment of care, got two questions for the audience here. Like, who here has met the ubiquitous patient? You know, that patient that represents all patients and access to the hospital. Okay, same question. Who's met the ubiquitous provider? All right. So when, I think about environment of care, there's quality, there's safety, and there's access, right? And those are facilitating the safe operations of that facility and the access to the care for the general population, right? But that general population crosses a lot of different spectrums, a lot of different needs, neurodiverse needs and things of that sort. The environment of care is that standard that's set up through, JCAHO and other regulatory requirements. But it balances the access needs of the specific community. It may be a community of folks that are sort of in the geriatric realm or cultural issues. And so that environment of care is treated episodically in a lot of systems, right? You're on a 3-year JCAHO cycle, right? You go through the JCAHO inspection, and then everybody relaxes, right? For 2.5 years until the 6-month window for the next one that comes. And there's oftentimes no deliberate management of maintaining that environment of care, that environment of quality, safety, and access all through that period. So the trend is going to more managing that in a more real-time, proactive way. In fact, that's the way that we operate in the military. We try to. We don't try to just be inspection ready when the inspection there. We want to be ready and in a state of readiness continuously. And so this concept of taking your environment of care and balancing it with your operational needs, it's typically driven by financial issues and things of that sort. But it does require one to step back and take a holistic look at the facility and the operations as a whole. Most of the activities that you do in your medical facilities are done in reaction to some financial stress. So there's an index called the Facility Condition Index. And most systems for a hospital are trying to manage that from 5 to 10% of their deferred maintenance backlog. That's a reasonable area. When you get to 20, 30, 40% backlog, which some systems have, then that's usually an indicator that your system's probably going to go into some sense of extremis. And so now you have to look at some of those critical functions like the OR functions, all of the licensed functions. And you have to make hard choices. We got to keep those in a constant state of readiness. But guess what? You may be, you look at the typical nonprofit health system in 2022 had a margin of 0.2%. Most need 2% just to sustain when things are good. So call it a 5 to 10% deferred maintenance backlog, or FCI. You can sustain on 2%. But most systems have been woefully underfunded, woefully undercapitalized for years. So their number is closer to 4 to 5% that you need to reinvest to maintain a level of care that's consistent with what we expect as a standard. So that's viewed as a tsunami. That's out there, and it's been accumulating not over 5 years, 10, 15, 20 years. And that bill's going to come due, pretty soon here. You compound that with the amount of acquisitions and mergers that are going on, and that requires a real drive to rationalize the infrastructure. And so those things are going to be happening in a very, the Army talks about VUCA. It's a very volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment. And so the question is, as we talk about managing that environment of care, with this tsunami coming in, what are some of the challenges that we're going to have in just resource allocation? Joanne talked about, modeling and simulation, which as an engineer, I think is woefully needed in healthcare to really understand what are the various sensitivity analysis to, investment profiles that are going to manage an acceptable environment of care going forward. And we can close our eyes and pretend that the tsunami's not going to come, but typically when the lights start going out and the water shuts down and those real critical functions cease, and your access to capital becomes increasingly limited, then it pretends really hard decisions. We either do it in a planned and structured way now, or we allow circumstances to drive us to make decisions that may not necessarily be aligned with our go-forward strategies. So setting that environment of care standard and managing to it, I think is going to be a critical issue going forward.
Thank you, Mitch. I mean, I love that it went to both a clinical perspective from Bill and an economic perspective from you. But fact of the matter also is that the capital budget and the operating budget are used as different things. So we don't see the investment we make in the built environment as an operational investment. We don't measure our built environments the same way. We have someone here from New York Health, and everyone was getting excited about his title because it's Director of Design and Evaluation, right? But how many systems even do that evaluation? So this idea of holding ourselves accountable to a united outcome is so key. And that doesn't happen if the built environment has a different set of accountability than all the other systems and policies we're talking about. So when we close, Mitch, you're going to have to close on a cheerful note.
Oh, was that kind of power?
But it was real, and I really appreciated that. So Marta, I'll ask you to close out the panel from a real estate perspective and what you were starting with on how the built environment can help. Then we'll take a few questions. So this is your second to think about them, and then have closing remarks from everyone.
All right. So as we think about the city, we think about city planners, developers in the real estate space, policymakers. And what it comes down to is that the environments we create actively can support brain health and brain capital, but it takes that intentionality to happen. And I do want to zoom in really quickly before zooming out for scale and talk about what do we mean by a healthy building? What do we mean by a green building in this case? I have a list here. One is around electrification, taking away any on-site fossil fuel combustion from buildings. That means electric cooking, electric heating, electric water heating. The idea that there's a statistic that 1/6 of childhood asthma is caused by gas stoves and the fumes that is from that. So this idea of electrification is one key piece of healthy buildings and green buildings. Another piece that we think about is daylighting. The idea of having daylighting really actively supports cognitive function and includes good views. Also, it's in a number of healthy building certifications and green building certifications. The idea of biophilia and biomimicry, to have nature and natural patterns and designs in your environment, all of this brings good cognitive health and cognitive function to an asset. We also think about thermal comfort. So the idea that if you feel too cold or you feel too hot, you may be lethargic or you may be jumpy. You're not performing at your peak optimal performance, and that detracts from your peak potential brain capital. It really all ties together. The last piece I have here is around active design. And this space here from Steelcase is a terrific example of an active staircase. How many stairwells have you been in buildings that look like you might be killed in them? But this one, everyone wants to take these stairs. They're beautiful. You're saving energy by not taking the elevator. You are helping your body become more active and healthy by taking the stairs. These type of active design elements in buildings are also a trend that we're seeing to improve the health of the occupants, the energy efficiency and greenness of the building, and also the overall kind of brain capital that we see in the space. One other piece that I'll note that's a bit of the emerging side of things on building materials. There are a lot of early innovators, I would say, looking at healthy building materials. The idea of low VOC paint, I think a lot of us have heard before, but there are a number of other considerations about healthy building materials and even measuring them with HPD's, health performance declarations, to understand how healthy a material is for your space. So you can ask for these numbers and you can use them to in your building's procurement specs, whether it's fitting out a space, designing a hospital, or whatnot, to ensure that you have even healthier of a space. So all of these elements fit into this concept of a healthy green building. And the other piece worth noting when you think about the city level, the community level, is that there's a huge equity play here. When everyone in the community can benefit from the healthy aspects of a building, it's beautiful, to put it bluntly. The idea that these public health benefits, one building can have an outsized impact for its tenants and the broader community. And these public health benefits, they're mitigating climate change. They affect everyone, and disproportionately communities that are traditionally BIPOC and low and medium income communities that have been disproportionately affected by climate change are also disproportionately prone to benefit from these public health and healthy building improvements. So there's a real opportunity to make that equity case and build that as part of the business case for these assets in this development. Now, when it comes to scale, we think about what can the city do, and I'm closing out, I promise, because I know we have questions, and then we close out. There's zoning, there's codes, there's a real case for healthier buildings, helping communities, helping brain capital, helping public health, and this includes some really wonky things in the city space around upzoning policies to support health, supporting social equity, so supporting climate action and resilience. Cities and localities can allow or incentivize or require developments to have these healthy building certifications or be net zero energy, net zero carbon, achieve certain green building certifications to get perks like accelerated permitting approvals or increased density. All of these things around transit-oriented development, parks and open space that come with this broader concept of healthy buildings, the built environment, and brain capital are really something that cities can champion and policymakers to make these changes happen at scale, not just rely on the private sector, who is already doing great work, to do these type of things, but to make it happen at scale and really accelerate that action. We're seeing policy movement from the city level in zoning, building codes, and incentives to make this move.
Nanda, I'm actually glad you closed on that because you laid out the design continuum from policy to urban planning to neighborhood planning to building design to interiors to the people within it eventually. So I really love that. So quick questions. Where's our time peaker? Thank you. We have 5 minutes, so the nature of your questions determines the time for closing. I'm just going to call you Weave. Here, let me pass.
Yeah, I mean, I was just impressed by the panel. I was thinking about the work of Stephen Johnson, his book, Where Do Good Ideas Come From? He talks about adjacent possibilities. When we get cities, we get massive innovation. And to an extent, I think that's what you've been talking about, proximity and creative collisions, etc. But I was also wondering if you know the work of Hassan Bakshi, world-renowned economist on creative clusters. He talks a lot about how actually, when we try and design an ecosystem, sometimes we disturb ecologies that are just starting to emerge by providing the latest, subsidized rental, fast Wi-Fi, great coffee, lots of cushions. But it sounded like, Tom, that you were actually solving that to an extent. I would love to hear more about, really developing the curricula of schools and, embedding all sorts of agents in the design process. But the provocation at the end, in a way, is, we're at a UN event. A lot of my friends have been involved in UN refugee camps. The UN's obsessed with straight lines of white tents, no structure, no design to the community. The average length of time that people are in refugee camps now is over 11 years. So we could try and forget that, or we could really acknowledge that these are towns and cities, and refugees, we're going to have many more. So, in some of the work that my friends did, they actually introduced town squares and gardens, and people developed place-specific solutions to food security. They wanted to share some of those solutions with other refugee camps. If this is a real problem, and we're finding solutions for some of our cities, through these brilliant people on the panel, should we actually be looking at refugee camps and introducing some of these innovations?
Yeah,
We're going to take all the questions and then we'll address them in the closing remarks. So that's a brilliant provocation.
So thank you all. I have like 1,000 questions because I really love this space.
Be careful, this man is a doctor. He's an architect described as a doctor. I found out at lunch he actually has, I think, a landscape architecture background.
My
You should have nodded. at
my
the
mentor
onset.
is a landscape architect, yes. But so there's a lot of work on urban design, development, proximity of things that people need every day. Grocery store proximity to homes improves walkability of neighborhoods, all of that kind of stuff. The challenge, though, is we build these great places in Philly or elsewhere, and it gentrifies. And then we drive people out of those communities because of price, or developers will check the box on the 5%, occupiable cheap housing, but it's really still a lucrative, higher-end market that we're building these beautiful communities in. How do we, if we're thinking about brain capital and thinking about disparities and a lot of the other stressors, make sure that this doesn't become a solution for the more well-off and exclude those at highest risk because we're creating communities that people are priced out of?
Thank you. All right, so I think both those questions covered a wide range, so I'll pass, or please take the mics on to answer them and then make closing comments. And they have to be on a note of optimism.
Yeah.
For the rule. No, that was for everyone.
So yeah, let me. I'll do the optimistic deal. I think people, when they're developing their own communities, all right, those communities I think become more responsive to them. So in Philadelphia, I'm in Philadelphia too, through the Urban Land Institute, really sort of working to help Black and brown folks understand those processes, have access to decision makers, and really get them, most importantly, the capital to be able to do some of that work. So I think when people are building their own communities, they are much more sensitized to the signals coming out of those communities than any of us from outside could be.
And nothing about us without us, right? Yeah. Thank you. Closing thoughts, Jen?
I suppose my closing thought is just to really double down on, I think, what architecture, interiors, what design can accomplish. That we've spoken a lot today about the performative nature of our work. You've heard a lot even about the sustainability and environmental aspects of the work. But frankly, what we set out to accomplish is not always tangible. In fact, we talk a lot about the value of intangibility and the value of humanity in our work. We set out to design for things like, I'm specifically thinking about the future of retail for Ford Motor and for electrification. We are hoping to design to provide emotional safety. I don't mean even physical safety, emotional safety. We are hoping to design to accomplish things like rebuild trust. So I think about this, actually your ask for the refugee camp, as a potential scenario. God, what could we accomplish, on the topic of the value of intangibles, additional to good planning? I'm going to take that on. Thank you. Yeah.
And I have a real quick high note.
Of course.
So, I kind of left a cloud there a little bit, but here's how I've dealt with that cloud over the last 12 years. It's like 6 pillars to help you transform an organization. Strong governance. If you know what you're going to do, if you're wrapped around the right standards and you've set the expectations of the organization, you've managed those from a governance standpoint, the processes that are tightened up around that so that you're making strong decisions that can be actually executed, then you've got the workforce development, which we've talked about. Not building that workforce for today, but the workforce for tomorrow. Digital transformation, understanding how you can, curate technology in an intentional way. It can't be done through osmosis. That's what we're kind of doing now. You have strategic partnerships and you focus on changing the culture. Doing those 4 things helped us bring about $250 million worth of value to the Jefferson Health System in 4 years, right? So it is possible. And you don't always have to spend more money to get safety, quality, and those things if you plan up front. And so my big message is be intentional in that forward vision and that forward plan, and we can do a lot of things with the resources that we already have. Is that positive there?
It's positive.
All right.
Tom.
All righty. So I'm going to bring it back to the human element and away from the built environment for a moment. So if you think about DNA, right, we all share about 92% of the common DNA. It's that other 8% that really makes us unique, right? In our looks, in our behaviors, in our mannerisms, makes us us. So if you've seen one innovation district, like we've talked about, you've only seen one innovation district, right? So each one responds to the intellectual capital, the innovation, and the unique infrastructure of its anchors, universities, academic medical centers, large companies, and others. It responds to the proximate and geographic advantages of its region and that larger ecosystem. But it really comes home in the authenticity, the inclusion, the land, and the people of the neighborhood and community in which it is sited. So in University City, in Philadelphia, there was no housing. So the housing that was built took pressure off the neighborhoods and actually reversed what would have been a gentrification trend. It took kids from Drexel out of Mantua and put them back in campus housing or market rate housing, so that helps, right? So that's a difference. In Baltimore, they did a home ownership program for the West Baltimore communities of Pigtown and Poppleton and Hollands Market and others. In Sacramento, California, the city actually worked with the community and they agreed upon a location for workforce housing and everybody was required to pay into that. And so that worked. Each one of them is different. The solution on Euston Road in London is different than it is in the Grand Canal in Dublin, right? Run-to-N in Medellin is way different than Winston-Salem. And Toronto, what's happening at the corner of College and University, is much, much different than what you're going to find on the Phoenix Biomedical Core in downtown Phoenix. So take all of those elements and create the solution that is unique to you. And ending on that wonder note, I just wonder, did anybody else realize this morning that as the sun moved through the glass on the building, each of those metal slats began to reflect the different colors of the rainbow? Right? And so it really becomes, how do you take something as common as light and diffuse it into something as beautiful as the spectrum?
Thank you, Tom. Beautiful closing. Bill.
Well, as an aging baby boomer, I can tell you that my generation is so sufficiently narcissistic that we will not tolerate for ourselves what society offered to our parents and grandparents. But we are running out of time. It is shameful that so many people need to raise their hand and say, I want no part of a nursing home. We cannot accept that going forward. So within the next decade, I'd like to see a lot more hands get raised, because congregate care has some wonderful opportunity to enrich the lives of people. We're just not doing it properly. And being at home alone in your community doesn't have to mean being socially isolated, where the only communication or connection you have is to somebody who's 40 years younger than you, who comes from a different culture and spends most of her time on her phone texting with her friends, instead of engaging you in a lifestyle that's rewarding. We can do better. We can do better. We must do better by bringing together the sensibilities of the built environment, philosophies of care that respect our humanity, and leveraging technologies which have an opportunity to transform our lives in ways we never imagined were possible just a few years ago.
I feel like that's like a brilliant closing, because Marta, you had like a closing statement in your previous statement too. I feel like we can do better is a great thought to close on. Thank you so much to the panel, and thank you all.